Today's gospel has at the heart of it a moment of prophetic awareness, of prophetic imagination. The gospel writer Luke tells the story of Mary and Joseph bringing the infant Jesus into the temple for circumcision and naming. And here in the temple, we hear of the merging of two rituals: purification after childbirth and presentation of a firstborn son. And so Jesus begins his life in a devout and law-keeping Jewish family. But this is also a story about suffering. The prophet Simeon has been waiting for God to comfort Israel, and the prophet Allanah is in touch with the people who are waiting for redemption for Israel. They're both living in a world of patient hope, where suffering has become a way of life. And now comes the moment of hope. Luke wants his listeners to know that this infant Jesus is the hope, the long-awaited hope. Israel's history is being lifted out of its suffering. But not only is this hope for Israel, but it is also to be the hope for all people. Simeon's first response to the presentation of the infant Jesus is not to speak, but to receive the baby in his arms. In receiving Jesus, Simeon is receiving the consolation of Israel. The exclamation of Simeon is captured in that beautiful hymn we call the Nunc Dimittis. Some of us will know it so well. We've used it in evening prayer liturgies from the 4th century onwards. But Simeon expresses his readiness to die because in seeing Christ, Simeon perceives that he has seen the salvation of God. And now, as you heard in our gospel readings from Isaiah, this echoes the prophetic passages, and Simeon's song echoes the trust and the hope. At the end of the book of Isaiah is a vision of a new creation that will deeply restore justice and bring comfort and consolation. God will enact something new. And now Luke, the gospel writer, gathers his listeners into an alternative imagination. There has been suffering and no comfort. There has been yearning and longing for the new. And now, here in the infant Jesus, there is radical amazement. Even Mary and Joseph are amazed. They've got a long way to go to know who their son is and what he's about. Jesus is pictured here in this story as the today fulfillment of consolation and hope for the suffering ones. Jesus comes now as the one who shares the vision of a different world in which those who are on the edges are the central concern of his heart and of his life and of his ministry. The outsiders, the suffering ones, are the core of his narrative. It is Jesus' sustained concern for suffering ones that connects Jesus' ministry to those of the prophet of Israel, and in particular to Elisha and Elijah. But like Simeon and like Anna, there's a longing in our hearts too that things need to be different, that we long for things to be different. If we're to take suffering seriously, as Jesus did, then where we're living and how we're living in this world is not good. We are in big trouble, and there is deep suffering. The dominant culture of our day cannot credibly sustain well-being for all. We ask, can peace ever come to the earth? Can justice prevail? What hope is there for us all? What hope can be imagined for our world? Have we gone too far? This is where today's gospel still energizes with hope. The gospel narrative gives voice to new possibilities, both then and now. There is a clear and direct and important connection between the summons of the prophetic in the ancient texts and the contemporary practice of life and ministry now. There is a need more than ever for the prophetic voice of the church, of the community of faith, a prophetic voice that still needs to call into question the ethos of those who hold dominant power in our day. These ancient texts can shape our frame of reference today. They can still energize us in our own context. Indeed, it could all be seen as idealistic and a waste of our time. Indeed, it could be a pious illusion that we are following if it had not been for the profound change, radical change that happened in the lives of the followers of Jesus, of those whose lives he touched and whose lives his prophetic imagination and hope touches today. So it's grounded, it's real. It's not a pious illusion, but it does need to be grounded and worked with in ordinary dailiness, not necessarily in big acts of special activism, but in noticing, attending, attuning to what is going on what is happening, both in our own lives and the lives of each of us here, and of those outside our door, our neighbours, and our nearest neighbour, the City Mission. It seems the dominant culture has little to offer. It has failed to provide comfort and consolation for the suffering ones of our world. It has failed to provide well-being and sustenance for so many. People do not get helpless by themselves. People are rendered helpless by unjust systems. Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, writes in his text, Prophetic Imagination, there is a remarkable depth of numbness in the dominant culture. It can manage charity and good intentions, but it does not take suffering seriously. It cannot stand in solidarity with those who are suffering and in pain. Jesus had the capacity to give voice to the hurting ones, whose voice had been muted, and therefore newness began to emerge from painful extremities to surprising newness. This is the story of so much of the Old Testament. We see it in Isaiah, as we read today. We see it in the Psalms. Painful extremities can give rise to surprising newness. Perhaps Jesus carried this prophetic imagination deeply within his heart, within his life. The capacity to imagine a world beyond what we take as the established given. The ability to walk into different contours of newness, of which there may be only a hint or a trace, a sliver of hope, a fissure of light. But there is a sense of something more and something other at work. In an excerpt from William Blake's work called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he writes this: the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel dined with me, and I asked them how they dared so roundly to assert that God spake to them, and whether they did not think at the time they would be misunderstood and so be the cause of imposition. And Isaiah answered, I saw no God, nor heard any. As I was then persuaded and remain confirmed that the voice of honest indignation is the voice of God. I cared not for the consequences, but wrote it. Now, as always, it is time to summon our community of faith, to summon up our deeply rooted theological call. It's not ideology, it's not socialism, it's not liberalism, it's not any other ism. It's a deeply rooted theological call to continue to be prophetic in our context, to bring hope to where we are located, to nurture and strengthen each other, to our commitment to the alternative vision of Jesus, of how the world could be. To dare to still say Jesus is the symbol of hope in our midst, the energizing one, the one who holds us, and the one who opens up the new possibilities. This is what Simeon saw in the infant Jesus. Is this what we can still see today? Amen.